My name is Renata Cole. I'm 38 years old, and for 6 years I paid the mortgage on a house I was told I would never own. If you're watching this, you've probably felt it too, that quiet, sinking feeling when you realize the people who were supposed to love you unconditionally have been keeping score the entire time. Not love. A ledger. And you were never the one they planned to leave anything to. So let me tell you exactly how it happened. Stay until the end, because the lawyer knocking on my mother's door the next morning was not the end of this story. It was just the beginning of hers. Before I start, I want to say one more thing, because I know some of you watching have lived a version of this yourselves. Maybe it wasn't a house. Maybe it was a business you built that someone else's name ended up on. Maybe it was years of being the one who remembered birthdays, paid for emergencies, showed up at 2 in the morning, while someone else got called thoughtful for sending a single text message. If that's you, I want you to know, before this story even really begins, that what happened to me wasn't really about money. It was about the moment you finally understand that being useful and being valued are not the same thing, and that no amount of usefulness will ever earn you the value you deserve if the people around you have decided, quietly, that you don't need it the way someone else does. If this story feels familiar to you in any way, I'd genuinely love to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell me which part hit closest to home, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing, because there's a lot more of these stories coming, and I think some of you need to hear that you're not alone in this particular kind of exhaustion. Now, let's go back to the beginning. I was the responsible one. Every family has one, the kid who pays for things quietly, who shows up early, who never asks for help because she learned a long time ago that asking made her a burden. My younger sister, Dahlia, was the golden one. 2 years younger than me, prettier in the way that made relatives sigh and say she's going to break hearts, and from the time we were children, she was excused from almost everything. If she forgot a chore, she was creative, not disciplined. If I forgot a chore, I was lazy, just like your father, a man who left when I was 9 and Dahlia was 7, a man neither of us heard from again. My mother, Glenna, raised us alone in a rented 2-bedroom apartment in Ohio. She worked 2 jobs, a daytime shift at a dental office and weekend hours cleaning a church hall, and I remember being 12 years old, making dinner for both of us because Mom was too exhausted to stand at a stove. I tell you this not for sympathy, but because it matters for what comes later. Because I grew up believing that love was something you earned through usefulness. And I spent the rest of my life trying to earn it. By the time I was 26, I had a stable job in logistics management, no debt, and a 5-year plan. Dahlia, at 24, had dropped out of 2 different programs, racked up nearly $11,000 in credit card debt, and was living in my mother's spare room, the same spare room she'd lived in, on and off, for most of her adult life. I didn't resent her for that. Not at first. I genuinely believed people find their footing at different speeds. What I didn't expect was that my own footing would be used as a resource for hers. It started small. Could you help me with this month's rent, just until I get back on my feet? I sent $400. Then $600. Then, when she totaled her car, I sent $2,000 I didn't really have to spare, because my mother called me crying, saying, "She has no one else, Renata. You're the strong one. You're the strong one." I want you to remember that phrase, because I heard it for the next 12 years, and every single time, it meant, give more, expect nothing back, and don't complain. There's another memory from that era I think about now, with everything I know. I was 14. Dahlia was 12. We were at our grandmother's house for Christmas, and our grandmother, my mother's mother, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Edith, pulled me aside in the kitchen while I was drying dishes. "You're going to take care of everyone, aren't you?" she said. It wasn't a question. She said it the way you'd comment on the weather, like it was simply a fact she'd already accepted about me. "Your mother does it too. Her mother before her. Some of us get born into the job of holding everyone else up, and nobody ever asks if we wanted it." I didn't understand what she meant back then. I do now. I think Edith saw the shape of my life forming before I did, and she said that sentence not as a warning, but almost as a kind of grim permission, go ahead, become what you were always going to become. I wish, now, that she'd said something else instead. I wish someone, anyone, had told 14-year-old me that I was allowed to put the dish towel down. When I was 30, my mother's landlord decided to sell the building she'd lived in for almost 15 years. She was 56 at the time, with no retirement savings to speak of and a fixed income that wouldn't qualify her for a mortgage on her own. I had, by then, built a decent life. I'd been promoted twice. I had savings. And when my mother called me, not asking, just stating, the way she always did, I don't know what I'm going to do, Renata, I might end up on the street, I did what I always did. I found a house. A modest 3-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood outside Columbus, listed at $210,000 at the time, a property that, 6 years later, would be worth $2.4 million after a developer bought up half the surrounding land and the area exploded into one of the most desirable suburbs in the state. None of us knew that then, of course. At the time, it was simply a house my mother needed and I could provide. I put down the deposit. I qualified for the mortgage using my credit and my income, because my mother's credit was too damaged from years of missed payments during hard times. The deed was in my name. The mortgage was in my name. Every payment, for 6 years, came out of my account. My mother lived there rent-free. Dahlia moved in with her 18 months later, after yet another relationship ended, and stayed. I remember the day we closed on the house with a strange, complicated kind of pride. I drove my mother out to see it before the movers arrived, just the two of us, standing in an empty living room with sunlight coming through bare windows, sawdust still faintly in the air from some repair the previous owner had left unfinished. My mother walked from room to room, touching the walls, and for one afternoon, I let myself believe this was a gift I was giving her, not a debt I was quietly assuming. She cried that day. She hugged me longer than she had in years and said, I don't know what I did to deserve a daughter like you. I held on to that sentence for 6 years. I didn't realize until much later that deserve and own are not the same word, and she had only ever meant the first one. For the first 2 years, I drove out almost every weekend to help with small things, fixing a leaking faucet, assembling furniture, sitting with my mother on the back porch while she talked about how peaceful it felt to finally have a yard after a lifetime of apartments. Those were good years, genuinely. I don't want to erase them just because of what came after. I think that's important to say, because revenge stories can sometimes flatten people into villains from the very beginning, and that's not honest. My mother loved me in the ways she knew how to. She also, separately, did something profoundly unjust to me. Both things were true at once. It was around year 3 that the language in the house started to shift, almost imperceptibly. My mother began referring to it, in conversations with neighbors, with her sister, even with Dahlia, simply as my house. Not the house Renata bought for me. Not the house we're lucky to have because of Renata. Just, my house. I noticed it the way you notice a single thread coming loose on a sweater. Small. Easy to ignore. I ignored it for 3 more years. I want to be clear about something, because people often ask me this when I tell this story. Did I ever ask for the house to be put in my mother's name, or for some kind of formal agreement? I did, twice. The first time, when I signed the mortgage paperwork, I gently suggested we draw something up, just something simple, stating that I owned the property and she lived there as long as she needed. My mother looked almost wounded. Are you saying you'd put your own mother out on the street, Renata? After everything I did for you? I never brought it up again. I told myself the deed was in my name. The mortgage was in my name. The bank statements were in my name. What more proof did I need? I learned, 6 years later, exactly how much that proof was worth to her. It was a Tuesday evening in early spring when my mother called and asked me to come to dinner that Saturday. Just a small family dinner, she said. Dahlia has some news. Dahlia's news, it turned out, was that she was engaged. Her fiancé, a soft-spoken man named Theo who worked in insurance, seemed like a genuinely decent person, and despite everything, I was happy for her. I brought a bottle of wine. I brought a card with money in it, because that's what I always did. I sat at that dinner table smiling, the way the strong one always smiles, even when something underneath her ribs is starting to feel cold. After dessert, my mother set down her fork, looked at Dahlia, then at me, and said the sentence that changed everything. Renata, your sister and Theo need a place to start their life together. I've decided to give them the house. I laughed. I actually laughed, because for one absurd second I thought she meant some hypothetical future house, some someday house we'd talk about in the abstract. But my mother's face didn't move, and Dahlia's eyes were already wet with anticipation, and Theo was looking at his plate like a man who already knew this was a done deal before he'd walked in the door. Mom, I said carefully, that's my house. I pay the mortgage. The deed is in my name. And this is the sentence I will remember for the rest of my life, the sentence she said without even raising her voice, like she was reminding me of something obvious. You're not the one who lives there, Renata. You're just the tenant who pays. Dahlia and Theo are starting a family. You don't even have anyone. What do you need a house for? You don't even have anyone. I want you to sit with that for a second, because that sentence wasn't a slip of the tongue. That was a worldview. In my mother's mind, the house was never mine because I had never been the one who mattered enough to deserve it. I was infrastructure. A function. A bank account with a heartbeat that existed to make other people's lives more comfortable. I asked, very quietly, does Dahlia even know I pay the mortgage? My mother waved a hand. That's not the point. The point is the family needs this more than you do right now. Dahlia, to her credit, or perhaps not, you'll decide, said nothing. She didn't defend me. She didn't say, wait, Renata pays for this house? She just sat there, twisting her napkin, letting her future be decided on the foundation of my 6 years of mortgage payments without a single word of acknowledgement. I sat in the car in my mother's driveway for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself drive. I didn't cry there either. The tears came later that night, alone in my apartment, sitting on the bathroom floor at 1 a.m. with the lights off, the way you cry when you're trying very hard not to wake a version of yourself that has learned, over decades, to be quiet about pain. I kept replaying the sentence. You're just the tenant. I thought about every wire transfer, every late mortgage payment I'd covered out of my own emergency fund during a slow month at work, every Saturday I'd spent driving 2 hours round trip to fix something at that house instead of resting, and I thought, none of it counted. None of it had ever counted. In my mother's accounting of love, only need counted, and I had made the mistake of never seeming needy enough. I left that dinner without finishing my wine. I didn't argue. I didn't cry, not yet. I drove home in silence, and somewhere around mile marker 40 on the highway, something inside me went very, very still. Before I left, though, there was one more exchange I haven't told you about, because it's the part that hurt the most, and I needed to tell you the rest first to understand why. As I was putting on my coat by the door, my mother followed me into the hallway. I think she expected me to be quietly upset the way I always was, the kind of upset that resolved itself within a week, the kind that never required her to actually change anything. She put a hand on my arm and said, gently, like she was offering me a consolation prize, you'll always have a place here too, Renata. You know that. This will always be your family home. It's not a family home, Mom, I said. It's a house with one name on the deed, and that name is mine. You just told me, in front of my sister and her fiancé, that I'm the tenant. Don't be so dramatic. You know what I meant. I know exactly what you meant, I said, and that was the last thing I said before I walked out the door. What she meant was this: ownership, in her mind, was not a legal concept. It was an emotional reward, distributed according to who needed comforting most in any given moment. By that logic, I would never own anything, because I had spent my entire life being cast as the one who didn't need comforting, the strong one, the stable one, the one who could absorb disappointment because she'd always absorbed it before. I want to tell you something important about the version of me that existed before that dinner, and the version that existed after. Before that dinner, I was a woman who absorbed. I absorbed unfairness because the alternative, conflict, confrontation, the risk of being called selfish, felt more dangerous than just quietly carrying the weight. I had spent 38 years building an identity around being the one who didn't complain. After that dinner, something shifted. Not into rage. Rage is loud, and loud people get dismissed as emotional, especially women, especially daughters. I didn't want to be loud. I wanted to be exact. The first thing I did, the very next morning, was pull every document related to that house. The original purchase agreement. 6 years of mortgage statements. Property tax records. Insurance policies, all in my name, because of course they were, because I was the legal owner of record, no matter what anyone at that dinner table believed. The second thing I did was call a real estate attorney named Priya Nazari, a woman I'd found through a colleague 2 years earlier when I helped a friend untangle a complicated lease dispute. I sat in her office on a Wednesday afternoon and laid out the entire situation: the house, the mortgage, the deed, the dinner, the sentence, "You're just the tenant." Priya listened without interrupting, which I appreciated, because I think she could see I needed to get the whole story out before she said a single word. When I finished, she asked me one question that I will never forget. "Renata, do you want to keep the house, or do you want to be free of what it represents?" I didn't have an answer right away. But over the following 2 weeks, as I sat with that question, I understood something about myself. I didn't actually want to live in that house. I had my own apartment, my own life, my own quiet rhythm that had nothing to do with that suburb or that street or my mother's expectations. What I wanted, what I needed, was for the truth to exist out loud, undeniably, where no one could ever again tell me I was just the tenant. So Priya and I built a plan. Not a revenge plan, not at first, a clarity plan. Priya was methodical in a way I found enormously calming. She didn't ask me how angry I was, or whether I wanted to win. She asked logistics questions. When was the mortgage originated? Had I ever co-signed anything with my mother? Were there any verbal agreements, texts, or emails where I might have implied a future transfer of ownership? Because if so, depending on the state, that could complicate things. I went home that night and searched 6 years of text messages with my mother, my stomach tight with a strange, retroactive anxiety, terrified I might find some careless sentence I'd typed in a moment of guilt-driven generosity, something like "This will be yours one day, Mom, don't worry," that could undo everything. I found nothing of the sort. Not because I'd been strategic. I simply never thought, in 6 years, that I needed to defend my own ownership of something so plainly, legally mine. That absence of language, it turned out, was its own kind of protection. "Good," Priya said, when I told her this in our second meeting. "That makes this simpler than most cases I see. The hard ones are when family members verbally promise things for years and then claim they never meant it. You never promised anything. You just paid, quietly, and let everyone assume what they wanted to assume. That's not a legal problem. That's an emotional one, and unfortunately, I can't fix that part for you." Here is something my mother and sister never understood, because they never asked, because asking would have required treating me as a person with a financial life of my own rather than an endless utility. The house was not just in my name. It was an asset on my personal balance sheet that I had, 2 years earlier, used as partial collateral for a small business loan when I briefly explored opening a logistics consulting firm. That venture hadn't taken off the way I'd hoped, and I'd quietly paid down that loan over time, but it meant something important. I had paperwork, dated and notarized, explicitly establishing the house as my asset, used at my discretion, with my mother and sister listed nowhere on any financial document related to it. Not as co-owners. Not as beneficiaries. Not even as authorized occupants in any formal sense. They were, legally speaking, exactly what my mother had so casually weaponized against me: occupants with no claim. My mother believed that emotional entitlement, years of guilt, years of "you're the strong one," years of being told what I owed this family, functioned the same as legal entitlement. It does not. And 6 years of one-sided generosity, however heartfelt, do not transfer a deed. Priya helped me confirm something else, too, because Dahlia and Theo had already begun planning their wedding around the assumption that this house was being given to them, even contacting a contractor about renovations, which I discovered through a single overheard comment from a cousin at that same dinner. My mother had, without my knowledge or consent, been representing herself to others as capable of transferring ownership of property she did not legally possess. That is not just a family overstep. In certain contexts, depending on what was promised and to whom, that can shade into real legal exposure. I didn't want to ruin my mother's life. I want to be honest about that, because this story isn't really about destruction, it's about the moment a person finally stops absorbing damage quietly and starts requiring the truth to be spoken honestly, on the record, by everyone involved. 2 weeks after that dinner, I had Priya draft a formal letter. Not a lawsuit. Not yet. A letter, sent by certified mail, addressed to my mother, with a copy sent to Dahlia and Theo as well, since they were the ones who had been led to believe the house was theirs. The letter was simple, almost clinical in its language. It stated, in plain terms, that the property in question was solely owned by me, Renata Cole, as evidenced by the attached deed and 6 years of mortgage records. That no transfer of ownership had occurred, nor had any been authorized, discussed in good faith, or legally initiated by the owner of record. That any representations made to third parties, including contractors, family members, or wedding vendors, regarding the transfer or gifting of this property were made without the knowledge or consent of the legal owner and carried no legal standing whatsoever. And finally, that the current occupants of the property, meaning my mother, were invited to begin a respectful conversation about the future of the home, including the possibility of a fair buyout, a formal lease agreement, or an orderly transition, within 30 days. I had Priya hand-deliver a copy as well, the morning after the letter would have arrived by mail, just to make sure there was no possibility of we never received it. That is the lawyer at the door I mentioned at the start of this story. My mother called me 11 minutes after Priya left her porch. I let it ring twice before I answered. "Have you lost your mind?" my mother said, her voice shaking in a way I'd genuinely never heard before, not sadness, but something closer to disbelief that the furniture of her own life had moved without her permission. "You sent a lawyer to my house?" "I sent a letter," I said, as calmly as I could manage. "Priya simply delivered a copy in person so there'd be no confusion. This is my home, Renata. I've lived here for 6 years. It's my home, Mom. I paid for it for 6 years." Those are two very different sentences, and I think it's time we both said the true one out loud. There was a long silence. And then, the line I expected, the line that had worked on me for 38 years, "After everything I sacrificed for you." "I know what you sacrificed," I said, and my voice didn't shake, which surprised even me. "I watched you work 2 jobs. I made dinner at 12 years old so you could rest. I have never once forgotten what you went through, and I have spent my entire adult life trying to repay a debt you never actually asked me to repay, you just let me believe I owed it. But Mom, listen to me carefully, paying a mortgage for 6 years on a house that was never legally mine to lose, and then being told at a dinner table that I'm just the tenant in front of my own sister, who said nothing, who let you say that about me, that is not sacrifice. That is the moment I finally understood what I actually am to this family. And I'm done pretending I don't know." She didn't have an answer for that. For the first time in my entire life, my mother was silent on a phone call with me, and the silence said more than anything she could have responded. 3 days later, Dahlia called. Not my mother this time, Dahlia, directly, for what I think was the first time in years that she'd reached out to me without needing something. "I didn't know," she said, almost immediately. "Renata, I swear to you, I didn't know you were paying for the house. I thought Mom owned it outright." "I thought." "You thought what, Dahlia?" "That a 56-year-old woman with no savings and damaged credit bought a $200,000 house on her own? You never once asked how that happened. You just accepted that the house existed and that it would someday be yours, the same way you've accepted most things in your life, without asking what they cost or who paid." She started crying, and I let her. I didn't comfort her the way I always had. I let the silence sit there, because for the first time I needed her discomfort to belong to her, not to me. "I'm sorry," she finally said. "I should have said something at dinner. When Mom said that about you, that you're just the tenant, I should have corrected her. I knew that wasn't fair, even if I didn't know the financial details. I've always let Mom lead, and it was easier to let her keep leading." It was the most honest thing my sister had said to me in over a decade. I won't pretend it fixed everything. But it was a start, and unlike my mother, Dahlia chose, in that moment, to start telling the truth instead of defending the comfortable lie. "I'm not trying to take your wedding away from you," I told her. "I'm not trying to leave Mom homeless. I'm trying to make sure that for once in my life, the truth about what I've done for this family gets said out loud, with my name attached to it, instead of erased every time it's convenient." Word travels fast in a family like mine, and within a week, my mother's sister, my Aunt Petra, a woman who had never once, in 38 years, asked me a single question about my finances, called to check in, which is family code for gather information to repeat to other relatives. "Your mother says you're suing her," Petra said, without so much as a hello. "I'm not suing anyone, Aunt Petra. I sent a letter through my attorney clarifying the ownership of a house I have paid for, alone, for 6 years. There's a difference. It just seems harsh, Renata. She's your mother. She's also a woman who told me, at a dinner table, in front of my sister and her fiancé, that I'm just the tenant in a home I paid $240,000 toward. Tell me, Aunt Petra, if Dahlia's husband had said that to her about her own house, would you be calling it harsh, or would you be calling it the truth finally getting said?" She didn't have an answer for that. Nobody in my extended family did, when I put it in those terms. I noticed something interesting in the weeks that followed. The relatives who'd been quickest to call me dramatic were also, conveniently, the ones who'd never once contributed $1 to that household, and yet felt entitled to an opinion on how I should feel about giving up the only real asset I owned. I stopped taking those calls eventually. Not out of anger, out of a simple recognition that their opinions cost them nothing and had cost me, potentially, everything. What happened next wasn't a courtroom drama. It wasn't dramatic at all, actually, it was quieter and, in some ways, far more satisfying than any shouting match could have been. The first real meeting happened in Priya's conference room, 3 weeks after the letter was delivered. My mother arrived with her own attorney, a tired-looking man named Gerald who, I later learned, she'd found through a discount legal service and paid for with money I strongly suspected came from a small loan against her car, which only deepened the irony of the entire situation. She sat across the table from me, her hands folded, her face arranged into the particular expression she'd always used when she felt wronged, a kind of dignified suffering, chin slightly raised, eyes a little too bright. "I want to say, before anything else," she began, "that I never meant for this to become so official. We're a family. Families don't do this to each other. Families don't tell each other they're just the tenant either," I said. "But here we are." Gerald cleared his throat and tried to steer toward numbers, which I appreciated, because numbers don't lie the way feelings can be made to. He suggested, on my mother's behalf, that perhaps the house could simply remain in the family, with my mother continuing to live there and Dahlia and Theo eventually inheriting it the natural way, whatever that meant, given that nothing about this situation had been natural from a legal standpoint in the first place. Priya didn't even raise her voice. She simply slid a folder across the table, 6 years of mortgage statements, the deed, tax records, the business loan paperwork establishing the house as collateral, everything laid out in chronological, undeniable order. "This is what in the family has actually looked like for 6 years," she said. "Ms. Cole has been the sole financial party responsible for this asset. Any path forward needs to start from that fact, not from a feeling about what families are supposed to do." I watched my mother's face as she looked through that folder, page by page, and I think that was the first moment the full financial weight of what I'd done finally landed on her, not as an abstract sacrifice she'd vaguely acknowledged at holidays, but as an exact, dated, notarized record of 6 years of her daughter's labor. She didn't cry in that meeting. I think some part of her was too proud for that, in front of Gerald, in front of Priya. But her voice was smaller when she spoke again. What do you want, Renata? Just tell me what you actually want. I want the truth on paper, I said. I wanted to say, clearly, that this is my asset, that I built it, and that whatever happens to it next happens because I choose it, not because I was guilted into it at a dinner table. We spent the next 2 meetings negotiating the actual terms, and I won't pretend every session was calm. There was one afternoon where my mother accused me, through tears, of punishing her for being poor her whole life, which stung in a way I hadn't expected, because some small, exhausted part of me almost believed her for a second, almost slid back into the old role of the daughter who apologizes for having boundaries. But Priya, sensing the shift in my posture, simply said, quietly, Renata isn't punishing anyone for being poor. She's declining to be punished for not being poor enough to deserve recognition. I held on to that sentence for weeks afterward. Within the 30-day window, my mother, through Priya, and eventually through her own attorney, agreed to a structured arrangement. The house would remain legally mine. My mother would be permitted to stay for up to 18 months under a formal lease agreement, at a modest below-market rent that, for the first time in 6 years, actually went towards something on paper, building a documented rental history rather than an invisible favor. After that period, the property would be sold, and from the proceeds, I would receive full repayment of my equity and 6 years of mortgage contributions before any remaining funds, which, given the dramatic rise in property value, were still substantial, were divided according to a fair agreement we negotiated, rather than one dictated to me across a dinner table. Those 18 months were strange. I visited less than I used to, not out of spite, but because the visits no longer felt like obligations disguised as love, they felt like choices, and I found I genuinely wanted to make fewer of them while everyone, myself included, adjusted to the new shape of things. When I did visit, my mother was different in small, careful ways. She asked about my work. Not performatively, actually listened to the answer, asked a follow-up question, something she'd rarely done before because my life had simply never been the subject that mattered at family gatherings. About a year into the lease period, she called me on a random Tuesday evening, no occasion attached to it. I was thinking about something, she said. The day we first walked through the house together, before the movers came. Do you remember that? I remember, I said. I told you I didn't know what I'd done to deserve a daughter like you. I think about that a lot now. I don't think I ever actually wondered what I'd done to deserve you. I think I just assumed I was owed you, the way I was owed everything else I'd struggled for. That's different, isn't it? Deserving and being owed. It was the closest thing to a real apology I ever received from her, and I let it be enough, because demanding a more complete one would have meant demanding she become a fundamentally different person than the one who raised me, and I'd finally learned the difference between hoping someone grows and requiring it before you'll allow yourself peace. Dahlia and Theo bought a smaller home 8 months later, a real purchase, in their own names, with their own mortgage, built on their own foundation instead of mine. Dahlia called to tell me, and for the first time, there was no expectation in her voice, no assumption that I owed anything toward it. Just news, shared the way siblings are supposed to share news. She invited me to see it the week they moved in. It was a modest 2-bedroom, nothing like the house she'd once expected to inherit, with boxes still stacked in the hallway and a half-assembled bookshelf leaning against the living room wall. Theo was up a ladder hanging a curtain rod, and Dahlia was directing him with the kind of bossy affection that made me smile despite everything. She showed me around like a kid showing off a treehouse she'd built herself, and at one point, standing in the small kitchen, she said, quietly, almost like she didn't want Theo to overhear, "This one's actually ours, you know? Like, the dead is ours. The mistake of the paint color we already regret is ours." I think I needed that more than I realized. I think that was the moment I finally, fully forgave her, not for the silence at that dinner table, which I'd already mostly let go of, but for the years before it, the years of quietly assuming that someone else's labor was simply background noise to her own life. Standing in her crooked, imperfect, entirely self-funded kitchen, I understood that she'd needed her own version of the lesson I'd been forced to learn at 38, that ownership, real ownership, the kind that teaches you something, requires your own name on the paperwork, your own sacrifice attached to the outcome. At her wedding, 6 weeks later, she asked me to give a toast. I almost said no. Part of me still flinched at the memory of that dinner table, of Theo's downcast eyes, of the napkin Dahlia had twisted in her lap while our mother decided my financial future belonged to her sister's future. But I said yes, because I'd realized something important in the months since the lawyer's letter. Declining to participate in my family's good moments wasn't strength. It was just a different flavor of the same old martyrdom, dressed up as boundaries. I kept the toast short. I talked about resilience, about Dahlia's stubbornness finally finding a worthy use, about Theo's patience. I didn't mention the house. I didn't need to. Some truths, once spoken clearly and put on paper once, don't need to be repeated at every family gathering for the rest of your life. They just need to exist, quietly, as fact, the way the deed to that house existed in my name for 6 years before anyone bothered to read it. My mother and I are, to this day, still rebuilding something. It is not the relationship we had before, because the relationship we had before was built on a misunderstanding I no longer accept, the idea that love and obligation are the same thing, and that the person who gives the most is somehow worth the least. She has, in her own way, apologized. Not with the words, "I'm sorry I called you just the tenant." I don't think she'll ever say that sentence out loud, but with smaller things. A phone call just to ask how I'm doing, with nothing attached to it. An acknowledgement, once, that she didn't think about how that sounded at dinner that night. It's not everything. But it's more honesty than I received in the previous 38 years combined, and I've learned to let that be enough for now. I want to tell you about one more conversation, because I think it changes how you might understand everyone in this story, including the people I haven't fully explained yet. About 4 months after the wedding, Theo called me out of the blue, asking if I'd be willing to grab coffee. I almost said no. My relationship with him had always been pleasant but distant, the kind of polite warmth you extend to a sibling's partner without ever quite letting them all the way in. But something in his voice on the phone made me say yes. We met at a small place near my apartment, and he seemed nervous in a way that didn't match the easy, soft-spoken man I'd known for 2 years. After some small talk, he set his cup down and said, "I need to tell you something, and I've needed to tell you for a while, and I think I've been a coward about it." "Okay," I said carefully. "At that dinner. When your mom said you were just the tenant." I knew that wasn't true before she even finished the sentence. He paused, turning his cup slowly on the table. "Dahlia had told me, maybe a year before, late one night, half asleep, that you paid for the house." She mentioned it so casually I don't even think she registered what she was telling me, like it was just a fact of the universe, the way you'd mention that the sky is blue. "Renata pays for it, but Mom acts like it's hers." That was the whole sentence. I remember it exactly because something about how easily she said it bothered me, even then. I sat very still. "So you knew?" "At dinner." "You knew, and you said nothing." "I knew," he said, and to his credit, he didn't look away from me when he said it. And I told myself it wasn't my place, that it was a family matter, that I was the outsider, the new guy, that speaking up would make me look like I was inserting myself into something that predated me by decades. But the truth is, I was scared. I was about to marry into this family, and I didn't want my first real moment at that table to be contradicting my future mother-in-law in front of everyone. So I looked at my plate instead. And I've regretted it pretty much every day since, especially once I understood, really understood, what those 6 years must have cost you, not just financially, but everything underneath that. I didn't forgive him immediately, not out loud, not in that conversation. But I appreciated, more than I expected to, that he'd told me the truth without my having to extract it from him. It's a small thing, maybe, compared to everything else in this story. But I've come to believe that small, voluntary honesty, the kind nobody forces out of you with a certified letter, is worth more than almost any grand gesture. My mother needed an attorney at her door to finally speak plainly. Theo needed nothing but his own conscience and 4 months of guilt. I know which one I trust more going forward. Why are you telling me this now? I asked him. Because Dahlia and I are trying to build something honest, he said. And I didn't think we could really do that while I was still carrying around a silence I was ashamed of. I figured you deserved the truth, even 4 months late. Especially since everyone else in this family seems to have a talent for only telling you the truth once a lawyer's involved. I laughed, despite myself, at that last line. It was the first time since the whole ordeal began that someone in my extended family had managed to make me laugh about it instead of just feel the weight of it all over again. We talked for almost 2 hours that afternoon, well past the coffee, well into a second round neither of us had planned on. He told me things about Dahlia I hadn't fully understood before, how much she'd internalized, growing up, the idea that she was the lucky one, the favorite, and how that label had its own quiet cruelty, because it taught her that her worth depended on being chosen rather than on what she built herself. She's working on it, Theo said. The new house helped. Having something that's actually ours, that we struggled for together, instead of something handed down, I think it's the first time in her life she's had to ask herself who she is without someone deciding for her. I think about that conversation often now. It reminded me that everyone in this story had been shaped, in different ways, by the same underlying lie, that love in our family was a finite resource, distributed according to need rather than earned through honesty, and that the only way to survive it was to either become indispensable, like I had, or become helpless, like Dahlia had, because both roles, in their own broken way, guaranteed you a kind of attention. Neither role, it turns out, guarantees you respect. Only the truth does that. And the truth, in my family, only ever arrived when someone finally refused to stay quiet. I think about that dinner table often. The wine I didn't finish. The card with money inside it that I'd brought for my sister's engagement, the same week I would learn my own mother considered me a tenant in a life I had quietly financed for 6 years. If there's one thing I want you to take from this, it's this: generosity without acknowledgement isn't love. It's a transaction that only one person knows they're making. And the moment someone calls you just the tenant in the house you've been carrying for years, you are allowed, you are required, to finally let the paperwork speak the truth your family refused to say out loud. I am not the tenant. I never was. And I will never again let anyone convince me that paying for something means I deserve less of it, not more. If you've made it this far, I want to thank you, genuinely, for sitting with this story all the way through. These aren't easy things to talk about, the quiet ways families teach us our own worth, often without ever meaning to, often while believing, the entire time, that they love us exactly the way we need to be loved. My mother believed that. I believe, even now, that she still believes it. And I've made peace with the fact that believing you love someone correctly and actually loving them correctly are sometimes two very different things, separated only by the willingness to ask the people you love what they actually need, instead of deciding for them. Thank you for listening to my story. If this resonated with you, if you've ever been the strong one, the quiet one, the one who pays and says nothing, I hope you take something from Renata's story today. The truth doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. It just needs to be said, clearly, once, and never taken back. If you want to hear more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed, and let me know in the comments what you would have done differently in my position. I read every single one, and some of your stories, honestly, are just as powerful as the ones I get to tell here. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and don't let anyone tell you that being needed and being loved are the same thing. They're not. You deserve both.